All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out, bearing the rainy weather, unfortunately. My name's Cassidy Westron. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the List Visual Arts Center. And tonight we're going to be joined by Brittany Ellis here for Graduate Student Talk. This is a series where we invite graduate students to expand on our exhibitions using their expertise in a similar subject matter as a way to see how art and research are overlapping on MIT's campus. Tonight, as I said, we'll be hearing from Brittany Ellis, a PhD candidate in the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture and the History, Theory, and Criticism of Architecture and Art programs. Her research explores how the nascent practices of photography and archaeology came together in the mid-19th century as means of representing and understanding the past. In this talk, Brittany Ellis will discuss her research on the early formation of a relationship between photography and archaeology, focusing on a series of photographic expeditions that took place in Egypt, Palestine, and Syria during the mid-19th century. Ellis will place these images in conversation with Basel Abbas and Ruanne Abou-Rahme, Only Sounds That Tremble Through Us, and reflect on the relationship between media and memory, presence and absence, land and history as staged in these encounters. At the end, we'll have a Q&A where you'll have a chance to ask any questions. And thank you so much for being here and showing interest in our programming. Now let's hear from Brittany.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining and braving the rain, as Cassidy mentioned. I want to just first start by thanking Cassidy and the rest of the LIST team for their generous invitation to share some of my reflections on the work by Basel Abbas and Ruanne Abou-Rahme, and a little bit about my work here at MIT. I also want to just express my gratitude to my friends, colleagues, mentors, advisors, and everyone else who's joining, and my appreciation for my fellow presenter this semester, Gita, who spoke with such great insight about the power of sound in this exhibition, and who shared her own sonic explorations of trauma, memory, and place. And on that note, I would strongly encourage you to return to the exhibition when the sound is on to get the full effect of the artist's work. I'm anchoring my talk tonight, however, not with sound, but with a singular image. And I'll speak more generally about my research at the end of the talk, but I wanted to kind of dive into a singular image which has been persistent in my thinking since I came across it 2 years ago. And I'll describe it briefly just so that everyone can have an idea of it, even if you can't see it. It shows a shallow interior space, at the center of which is a large stone box tightly framed with 4 long wooden rods with an alternating kind of checkered pattern. In front of this structure sit 3 semi-transparent human figures, 2 men dressed in white, one facing forward and the other in profile, and a man in a dark robe and head covering facing away. Their forms seem to hover above the large stone blocks that compose the space's ground, rather than to sit firmly upon it. Their facial features are hard to discern as the tones and textures of their skin and the stone box meld together. Closer inspection shows the figure of a woman behind the stone form. Her white collar stands out from the largely undifferentiated cloudy background of the image, bringing our attention to the faint outline of a pale face, dark hair fastened at the nape of a neck, and a torso disappearing behind the stark patterned rod. An unseen light source illuminates the arrangement from the left, highlighting the broken edge of the frontmost stone panel and the rope which appears to hold one of the patterned rods in place. And at the right of the image, a cluster of thin, bright lines form a long vertical stripe, and I'll get back to those lines in a moment. This is a photograph from the inside of the Great Pyramid, showing the interior of the so-called King's Chamber. It was made in 1865, one of a series made by the well-known Scottish scientist Charles Piazzi Smythe, who was the Scottish royal astronomer at the time. And these images which Smythe produced in the pyramid were the first known photographs made inside the monument, or in any tomb for that matter, and were some of the earliest made entirely using artificial light, in this case, burning flares of magnesium. The photographs were taken by Smythe in order to support his theory that the construction of the Great Pyramid was directed by God and evidenced in its sacred physical dimensions. Hence the presence of these checkered rods, which were in fact measuring sticks. Key to Smyth's argument were the dimensions of this stone structure, which he identifies as a coffer rather than a sarcophagus, asserting that the measurements were equal to those of the Ark of the Covenant as described in the Book of Exodus. The motivations behind Smyth's expedition are complicated, and they relate to both anxieties stemming from the doubt that novel scientific theories were casting upon biblical truth at the time, as well as a particular debate in British scientific circles over the adoption of the French system of measurement, a very controversial proposal. And Smyth saw these photographs due to what he called their remarkable witnessing capacity as offering incontrovertible proof of the divine measurements of the structure, from which, according to him, British measures were descended and must therefore be defended. And this witnessing capacity of the camera, of the photograph, was a common refrain by Smyth and his contemporaries, an understanding of the camera as being a kind of producing more accurate or objective images, though the concept of objectivity has, of course, been troubled subsequently. And the repeated presence of these pattern sticks, which are actually measuring rods, as I mentioned, emphasizes his commitment to the rigorous empirical examination of the pyramid, suggesting to his viewers that even the deepest, most remote parts of this structure and its interior have been subjected to careful scientific scrutiny. While Smyth's theories were quickly and soundly debunked by his colleagues and peers, his images nevertheless had broad popular appeal, and they circulated widely. Initially made as negatives on small 1 by 3 inch approximately glass plates, the images were enlarged and printed for edited albums, described in Smyth's published books, as well as photographic and scientific press of the day. They were publicly exhibited, and they were reproduced as glass lantern slides that could be projected during public lectures. And this image in particular, this reproduction of an image, enlargement and reproduction, comes from a set of such slides, the lantern slides, made sometime after 1874, and which ended up in Australia through evangelical missions taking place in the latter half of the 19th century. The photohistorians Stephanie Horstein and Larry Schaff have written in more detail about the production of these images and the role they played in the contemporary scientific debates and religious movements of the time. So I'm not going to wade too far into those topics. Instead, I'm interested in Smyth's description of this image in particular, and especially the 3 seated figures. In a caption from an album dated to 1879 of 50 prints made from Smyth's negatives, the scientist exclaims, this is a quote, "Great pyramid and ghosts of Arabs. The ghost-like figures of the Arabs might as well have been omitted, for with their black, unphotographable faces, they make very bad ghosts. And besides, the modern Arabs of Egypt are so ephemeral occupiers of the soil that they have no right to any place amongst the more ancient monuments of Egypt." End quote. And so here are the vaporous forms of these anonymous men, one of whom might be Smyth's interpreter, elsewhere identified as the experienced excavator Ali Gabri, become ghosts or ephemeral occupiers of the soil, in Smyth's words. Visually, their immaterial presences stand, or should say hover, in contrast to the solid form of the ancient sarcophagus and the sharp frame of Smyth's measuring rods. Smyth's characterization of contemporary Egyptians in this way was unfortunately not exceptional. In the accounts of European travelers, the reports of European colonial administrators, and the published studies of Egypt and the broader region known as the Orient, which proliferated throughout the 19th century, this is something of a trope. Local populations are construed as, at best, indifferent to history, and at worst, intentionally negligent or destructive, and consequently without right to land, monument, or history itself. And as generations of scholars, most notably kind of starting with Edward Said, have argued, these representations carry real weight, serving as justifications for decades of European intervention, everything from military incursion to the establishment of French control of the Egyptian Department of Antiquities. The ghosts in these images, both the figures here, but also Smythe's descriptions of them, have stayed with me since I first read about these photographs more than 2 years ago. And they came to me again when experiencing the work of Basel Abbas and Ruanne Abou-Rahme, whose work explores the way the past haunts, echoes, and persists in land and in bodies, and in the fragmentary archives of our digital era. Their 3-channel video installation, Only Sounds That Tremble Through Us, which you can see behind me, engages directly with this theme. It combines found video footage of weddings, funerals, protests, and other events across Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and Yemen, collected from social media, alongside original footage of improvisational reinterpretations of this footage by Palestine-based performers, which we can kind of see on the left here. Meanwhile, around us, behind us, you can see the piece where the soil has been disturbed, a field of steel panels and bricks from which desiccated stalks of Syrian thistle spring up. The wild thistle grows in areas of disturbance, including ruined Palestinian villages. And so the artist suggests that its presence serves to vegetally inscribe human histories of displacement. In exploring the potential of unofficial archives, these works ask us to consider how a society remembers and how memory persists in bodies, in vegetal bodies, in the land, and in various forms of media through experiences of erasure and loss. And of course, there is a particular urgency in their consideration of these topics in our present moment, as Palestinians are under military siege, facing violence and displacement that is unprecedented in its scope and scale, and yet also eerily familiar, echoing and extending historic episodes of violence, dispossession, and exile. Beyond evoking the recursivity of these cultural memories, though, Abbas and Abou-Rahme's work proposes that the persistence of memory feeds at the same time wells of resilience. And this video piece offers a suggestion of how one might activate this kind of energy and potential by using the body as a means of sampling, that is, interpreting, remixing, and amplifying the sounds, movements, and experiences of past bodies in the present. And here, remembering and haunting become entangled operations. In Abbas and Abou-Rahme's work, then, the figure of the ghost operates as a potent symbol of both material dispossession, but also of resistance. A ghost which becomes manifest in the movement and remediation of bodies. And while it could be enticing to read the figures in Smythe's photographs in this kind of subversive way, I'm wary, of course, of projecting a kind of present perspective onto this image from the past, but nevertheless, their semi-transparent forms do in fact register movement. It is the result of the figures moving, perhaps even leaving the scene during the long exposure times required to produce the image in the darkened chamber, which was quickly filling with smoke as Smythe burned more and more tapers of magnesium to produce the requisite light needed to expose his glass plates. And so while Smythe uses this kind of apparitional effect to visually underscore his comments about the impermanence of 19th century Egyptians, it also serves as a reminder of the limitations of this form of visualization, of photography. Even as Smythe strove towards scientific clarity, some of his subjects elude such insistent fixing. And these limitations are further suggested by two additional features of the image. The measuring rods, positioned here as guarantors of scientific accuracy, were also intended to correct for the distortion of perspective which camera lenses were already known to produce at the time. In other images, these rods appear remarkably foreshortened, emphasizing this distortion. The presence of the measuring sticks further indicates the inability or the limitations of the photograph alone to signify the dimensions central to Smythe's theories. At the same time, and returning to those streaks on the right-hand side, we can see the showering sparks of the burning magnesium itself as they rain down in the frame of the image. And they remind us of the laborious production of the photographic image itself. It took Smythe a week of experimentation in the chamber before he was able to successfully make an image, often being chased out of the chamber by the kind of cloying, choking smoke that he was producing. The traces, though, of the magnesium also bring our attention to the photograph as a material object. The illusion of the photograph as a transparent window to reality is disrupted by marks which emphasize its production. Elsewhere, a scratch or a hair, a piece of dust, either on the slide or in the negative or in any other kind of potentially other stages of its reproduction and remediation, reminds us that the photograph is an object as much as it's an image. And these features of the photograph, which to me are exciting because they register processes of making, also act as disruptions of a kind. And disruption or interruption is a key feature of Abbas and Abou-Rahme's work, in my opinion, in which the glitch or the idea of the fragment manifests repeatedly. And we see it in the fragmented stills from videos displayed throughout the installation, in the inversions of color, which produce negative images, in the interruption of the projected video with steel and cement panels, concrete panels, reminiscent of border walls and obscuring our vision. Such disturbances bring our attention to the mechanisms and limitations of representation and perception. They thwart the realization of a whole image. However, such an impossibility is, according to the artists, generative, as it prompts us to consider what can be gained by lingering in the gaps of what is known and knowable. This ambivalence is decidedly at odds with Smythe's photographic endeavor, which sought to produce a totalizing whole view of the pyramid. And bringing these two projects together tonight, I've sought to draw out some of the connections, inadvertent as they may be, between Smythe's photographic project and Abbas and Abou-Rahme's work. The former is one example out of many European projects that sought to author and authorize historic narratives using methods described as scientific, and in doing so, attempt to reconfigure access to monuments, land, and the past itself. We see this in the insistence within Smythe's photographs as an attempt to formalize a reading of the monument in support of a singular narrative. Abbas and Abou-Rahme's work, on the other hand, offers a critique of such projects of colonial control and their legacies. The artists seek to trouble any idea of fixity in their experimentation with fragments, glitches, and the potential of alternative points of view of existing in the negative. And I'd be interested to hear in the Q&A or afterwards whether you find them successful in doing so. Personally, I've used these concepts to consider Smythe's photograph here tonight, and this image made during his expedition forms a part of my broader dissertation project, still in formation, which is concerned with historicizing and theorizing a mutually formative relationship between photography and archaeology, two practices which emerged around the same time in the mid-19th century. Archaeology was, in fact, one of the first applications to which photography was recommended upon its public announcement in 1839. And in the decades which followed, a range of photographic practices were carried out throughout the world, but especially in Egypt and the broader Middle East. Projects which were described as archaeological in their investigation of material remains of the past. But this was also a time in which both practices were unstandardized, with photography still a novel, developing technology, and archaeological fieldwork still largely uncodified or professionalized. And so consequently, I find this period allows us to consider how the logics, visual, temporal, spatial, of each practice were being practically worked out on the ground and discursively framed through their public presentation in various forms. And my proposition is that photography and archaeology had a much more mutually formative relationship than has previously been discussed. And I'm interested in exploring how they came together in co-constitutive ways as techniques for overcoming the remoteness of the past and making time's passage not just perceptible, but meaningful in the surface of things, images, monuments, and the land itself. And so I have found the exhibition and particularly the work Only Sounds That Tremble Through Us to be a useful kind of prompt or opportunity to think further on the concept of the surface as noun and verb, interface, and excavation, particularly as it relates to the investigation of the past. And I've appreciated the opportunity to consider what happens when our gaze is arrested at the surface of representation through means of fragmentation, disruption, or repetition. So looking forward to engaging with you all. Thank you very much.